On the morning of August 10th, 1985, deep inside the remote naval repair base of Chazhma Bay near Vladivostok, the Soviet Pacific Fleet was preparing to complete what was supposed to be a routine refueling operation on a nuclear submarine, a task carried out dozens of times throughout the Cold War, a procedure that demanded absolute precision and discipline because even the smallest mistake could trigger catastrophic consequences. The submarine in question was K-431, a Project 675 Echo II class nuclear cruise missile submarine, one of the USSR's frontline naval assets designed to hunt American carrier groups across the world's oceans using nuclear-tipped anti-ship missiles. But today, K-431 was far from the open sea. It sat quietly beside a floating dry dock, its twin reactors shut down, its hull opened, and its crew replaced by shipyard technicians tasked with removing the old nuclear fuel and inserting fresh fuel assemblies. In theory, the operation was straightforward. In practice, it was one of the most dangerous maintenance tasks any Navy could perform. Refueling a submarine reactor required aligning control rods with extreme precision. It required strict compliance with safety procedures. It required a calm, controlled environment free from haste, shortcuts, or pressure from superiors. Unfortunately, at Chazhma Bay that morning, none of these conditions existed. The Pacific Fleet was notoriously understaffed, poorly funded, and overwhelmed with aging submarines in constant need of repair. Worse still, naval commanders were pushing to complete refueling operations quickly to impress higher-ranking officials in Moscow. That pressure would create a deadly chain of decisions. As technicians removed the reactor's protective lid and prepared to install new fuel assemblies, a minor alignment issue halted the operation. The supervising officer, eager to avoid delays, ordered the crew to lift the reactor lid higher than safety protocols allowed in order to reseat the fuel assemblies properly. The crane operator complied, hoisting the lid and the partially installed fuel rods upward, a fatal move. Unbeknownst to the team, lifting the reactor lid too high allowed water inside the reactor cavity to drain and shift unevenly. This sudden change altered the reactor's geometry, unintentionally creating a prompt critical reaction. A runaway nuclear chain reaction capable of producing an instantaneous energy surge. It happened in milliseconds. At 10:55 a.m., with no warning, the exposed fuel assemblies flashed with a blinding blue-white burst, the unmistakable glow of uncontrolled nuclear fission. And then the reactor detonated. The explosion tore through K-431 like a warhead. A massive pillar of radioactive steam erupted into the sky, visible across the entire bay. The reactor lid, weighing several tons, was launched hundreds of meters into the air before slamming into the sea. The blast ripped open the submarine's hull, shattered windows across the shipyard, and instantly vaporized the shipyard workers directly above the reactor. The force was so violent that ships moored nearby momentarily lifted from the water. Within seconds, the peaceful naval base transformed into a nightmare zone of chaos. Crews on nearby submarines watched in horror as radioactive debris rained down on the docks. The explosion released a massive plume of radioactive particles into the atmosphere. Fuel fragments, highly irradiated water droplets, and pieces of shattered reactor hardware glowing with lethal contamination. Those closest to the blast were killed instantly. Others who rushed in during the first seconds of panic were exposed to doses of radiation that guaranteed death within days. Yet at the moment, no one understood the scale of what had just happened. The Soviet Navy, desperate to hide the accident, suspended all external communication. Commanders ordered sailors to contain the fire and secure the wreckage without protective gear, without radiation suits, and without any accurate information about what they were walking into. The men who approached the wreck of K-431 did so unaware that the reactor had scattered fuel fragments across the dock, fragments emitting radiation strong enough to burn through human skin within minutes. Some sailors later recalled seeing glowing metal shards lying on the concrete and picking them up with their bare hands, unaware that these pieces were among the most dangerous substances on Earth. Others climbed onto the submarine to extinguish fires burning on its deck, breathing in hot, irradiated steam. They began vomiting within minutes, a sign of acute radiation syndrome. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders scrambled to contain information. No distress signals were sent to Moscow. No radiation alarms were sounded. Local civilians were not warned. Instead, officers sealed off the base and instructed medical staff to classify all radiation injuries as thermal burns or chemical inhalation injuries. But nothing could hide the truth from the sailors who watched their comrades collapse with bleeding gums, peeling skin, and uncontrollable tremors, the unmistakable signs of massive radiation exposure. Within hours, the explosion zone was saturated with deadly gamma radiation. The water surrounding K-431 glowed faintly with activated particles. Radioactive steam drifted across the bay, coating nearby hillsides and contaminating everything it touched: the soil, the trees, the wildlife. Yet due to secrecy protocols inherited from decades of Soviet nuclear policy, no civilian authorities were informed. No evacuation was ordered. Instead, senior officers sent unprotected conscripts into the blast zone to clean radioactive debris with shovels, brooms, and bare hands. These men were ordered to scrape glowing fuel fragments off the pier and pile them into makeshift bins without understanding that each moment of exposure shortened their lives. Some were given nothing more than cotton masks or thin gloves, items utterly useless against the invisible radiation soaking the air around them. Meanwhile, the surviving shipyard technicians were rushed to a naval medical facility and treated by doctors who had been instructed not to mention radiation poisoning. Several died that same night. Others succumbed over the next week, their bodies breaking down as bone marrow collapsed, organs failed, and internal bleeding spread uncontrollably, classic symptoms of lethal radiation doses. Despite the unfolding medical catastrophe, the Soviet Navy initiated a massive cover-up. All reports were classified at the highest level. Witnesses were silenced. Families of the dead were told that their loved ones had perished in a steam accident during routine maintenance. Even high-ranking Soviet officials in Moscow were given incomplete information. The contaminated dock, the irradiated hillside, and the glowing wreck of K-431 were photographed, documented, and sealed behind layers of secrecy. But radiation does not obey political directives. In the days following the explosion, radioactive runoff from the docks seeped into Chazhma Bay, contaminating the water and entering the food chain. Fishers in the region reported unusual patterns: fish dying mysteriously or appearing with strange burns and lesions. Some local residents later reported unexplained illnesses, though few were ever officially linked to the explosion. Soviet scientists who quietly measured contamination levels in the weeks after the accident found alarming results. Soil near the dock registered radiation levels hundreds of times above safe limits. Some hotspots reached levels comparable to those found inside reactor containment zones. Worse still, prevailing winds carried radioactive particles from the explosion into nearby forests and settlements, depositing invisible contamination on rooftops, gardens, and water sources. Yet publicly, the Soviet Union insisted that no harmful radiation had been released. The truth was buried. The affected area was labeled environmentally stable. Sailors who suffered radiation sickness were forbidden from speaking about their symptoms. Some were discharged from service with vague medical notes, their true injuries classified for decades. Others continued their naval careers, unaware that the seeds of cancer and long-term organ damage had already taken root. It would take years, long after the fall of the Soviet Union, for the full story of K431's explosion to emerge. And when it did, the world learned that the Chazhma Bay disaster was not just an accident. It was the direct result of systemic failures, rushed procedures, ignored safety protocols, pressure from superiors, lack of proper equipment, and a culture that prioritized secrecy over human life. But perhaps most chilling of all was this. Had the reactor lid not flown outward into the sea, but instead downward into the submarine's other systems, the resulting explosion could have ignited stored torpedoes and triggered a multi-megaton range detonation. One strong enough to obliterate the entire naval base, kill thousands, and contaminate a massive portion of the Soviet Far East. The K431 explosion was a catastrophe in its own right, but it was also a near miss far worse than the world ever realized. The truth of what happened that day in Chazhma Bay would remain buried for years, overshadowed by larger disasters like Chernobyl. Yet for those who were there, the sailors who inhaled radioactive steam, the conscripts who shoveled glowing debris, the technicians who watched their comrades die, the memory of that blue-white flash seared itself into their souls forever. And it was only the beginning of a story far darker than anyone in the Soviet Navy dared to admit. In the hours after the explosion, as the cloud of radioactive steam settled over Chazhma Bay, and the shattered remains of K431 smoldered on the water, the Soviet Navy scrambled to impose order on a disaster they barely understood and were utterly unequipped to manage, and their response quickly descended into a catastrophic fusion of secrecy, confusion, and fatal decisions driven more by fear of Moscow's wrath than by scientific reality. Senior officers, terrified of being blamed for the accident, refused to acknowledge the possibility of a nuclear chain reaction and instead insisted that the explosion was merely mechanical, ordering damage control teams, firefighters, and dock workers to continue approaching the submarine with no protective equipment, no radiation detectors, and no awareness of the lethal doses they were absorbing every minute. Many of these men rushed to rescue survivors, extinguish flames, or search for missing colleagues, unaware that the air around the submarine was saturated with aerosolized radioactive particles capable of burning through lung tissue, or that jagged fragments of irradiated fuel lay scattered like deadly confetti across the pier. Eyewitness accounts later described the surreal scene. Sailors coughing violently as they ran toward the wreck, firefighters climbing onto the submarine's hull, even as their boots softened from heat and radiation, medics trying to carry away unconscious workers who vomited blood before reaching the ambulance. Some rescuers began collapsing within minutes, overcome by gamma radiation so intense that their internal organs were being damaged in real time. Others complained of metallic tastes in their mouths, burning sensations on their skin, or sudden dizziness, classic early symptoms of acute radiation exposure. But their officers, following Soviet nuclear doctrine that valued secrecy above all else, insisted that these symptoms were caused by steam burns or shock. No one dared contradict them. At the Naval Medical Facility, doctors were ordered not to record radiation sickness on any charts, and medical logs were preemptively classified. Nurses washed the victims repeatedly, unaware that the radioactive isotopes were already inside their bodies. Some medical staff later admitted that they realized they were treating radiation cases, but speaking openly would have ended their careers, or worse. Meanwhile, the Navy launched an emergency cleanup operation, rushing dozens of conscripts into the blast zone with shovels, buckets, and bare hands to collect debris that was emitting thousands of Roentgens per hour. Many of these young men were barely 18 or 19 years old, drafted only months earlier, and they obeyed orders without hesitation, unaware that they were performing a task that would doom many of them to early graves. They climbed across the cracked concrete of the dock, scooping up metal fragments still warm to the touch, fragments that had once been part of K431's reactor core. Some conscripts reported that their hands blistered almost immediately. Others described glowing or hissing pieces of debris that gave off visible heat waves. Yet they continued working for hours, driven by fear, duty, and the shouted commands of officers who did not understand, or refused to understand, the scale of the danger. At one point, a group of sailors discovered a large chunk of fuel assembly wedged against a seawall. Unsure whether it was safe to touch, they radioed for instructions. The answer came quickly. Pick it up and carry it away. 2 men lifted it together. Both were dead within a week. As the day progressed, the atmosphere around the bay grew increasingly surreal and nightmarish. A hazy mist hung over the water, and sailors walking through it later recalled feeling their skin prickle and burn. Birds that flew near the blast site dropped out of the sky. Fish washed up dead along the shoreline. Nearby hillsides, coated in radioactive fallout, shimmered faintly under the sun. But despite these unmistakable signs of contamination, the Soviet command structure remained fully committed to the cover-up. No civilians were warned, no ships were rerouted, no farms or fisheries were shut down. Instead, naval officers established a perimeter around the base and placed armed guards at every exit, threatening severe punishment for anyone who attempted to leave or speak with outsiders. That evening, as the first victims began arriving at hospitals, medical teams quietly noted horrific symptoms. Skin reddening into deep burns, despite no contact with fire. Hair falling out in clumps, uncontrollable vomiting, bleeding from gums and eyes, and sudden blackouts. Some patients were so radioactive that their clothing had to be removed and burned immediately. But still, no one dared record the truth. The official cause of all injuries was listed as steam exposure. Meanwhile, contamination spread far beyond the blast site. Rainfall carried radioactive particles into nearby forests, where soil readings spiked to thousands of times the safe limit. Local villagers, unaware of the disaster, continued tending crops, collecting water, and fishing, while children played along shorelines contaminated with strontium, cesium, and uranium fragments. The Soviet Union's obsession with secrecy ensured that none of them were warned. Back at the base, investigators arrived from the Pacific Fleet Command to assess the situation. Instead of focusing on safety or containment, they focused on blame. Officers shouted at surviving technicians, demanding to know why protocols had been violated. Crane operators were interrogated harshly. Supervisors were threatened with prison. But none of these questions addressed the immediate crisis. A cracked submarine reactor leaking residual radiation into the bay, a contaminated environment stretching miles across coastline, and dozens of sailors suffering irreversible radiation poisoning. Despite the chaos, some attempts at containment were made, but they were slow, disorganized, and dangerously inadequate. Radiation detectors were brought in late that evening, and readings near the submarine were so high that meters maxed out instantly. Engineers attempted to cover the reactor compartment with improvised shielding, using sheets of metal and wooden planks, but their efforts were futile. Others tried washing the dock with seawater, unaware that they were spreading contamination deeper into the bay. When night fell, searchlights illuminated the wreck of K431, revealing twisted metal, scorched paint, and a dark pool of radioactive water sloshing around the ruined reactor chamber. The air remained thick with invisible poison. Firefighters rotated in and out of the scene, many unaware that each shift exposed them to lethal gamma doses. Some collapsed mid-task and were quietly carried to medical tents, where they were placed behind makeshift partitions to hide the growing number of casualties. By midnight, the full medical crisis was underway. Doctors struggled to treat victims whose conditions worsened by the hour. Some lost consciousness. Others suffered seizures. A few screamed in agony as their skin began peeling away, a sign that their bodies were shutting down. Yet Navy officials instructed doctors to continue listing all deaths as thermal injuries, terrified that Moscow would respond harshly if evidence of a nuclear disaster reached the Politburo before they could craft a sanitized explanation. The next morning, radioactive mist still clung to the hillsides, and the water of Chazhma Bay shimmered with contamination. Investigators finally acknowledged the need for proper containment, but even then, secrecy dictated every action. Teams wearing minimal protective gear were ordered to cut into the submarine, remove damaged components, and begin decontaminating the dock. These actions exposed yet another wave of sailors and workers to dangerous radiation levels. In total, more than 300 personnel were exposed in the first 24 hours alone, though the true number may have been far higher. But the most chilling part was still to come. Soviet engineers eventually discovered that the explosion had thrown highly radioactive fragments into nearby forested hills, contaminating soil and plant life with intensities that would remain hazardous for decades. These areas were quietly fenced off, though no public explanation was given. Hunters and hikers later wandered through these zones unknowingly, some developing unexplained illnesses years afterward. And through it all, the Soviet Navy insisted that nothing unusual had occurred. No national news outlets reported the blast. No warnings were issued to surrounding communities. Families of the dead were given vague explanations and pressured not to ask questions. The Pacific Fleet buried its dead quietly, behind layers of classification, with funerals conducted under strict supervision. Officially, the Chazhma Bay explosion barely existed. Unofficially, it was one of the worst nuclear accidents in naval history. It would take years, and eventually the fall of the Soviet Union, before the truth would start to leak out. The systemic negligence, the reckless shortcuts, the horrifying human cost, and the terrifying reality that the explosion, as devastating as it was, could have been far worse. For the surviving sailors and shipyard workers, the nightmare was far from over. Many would develop severe, long-term health problems, cancers, organ failure, infertility, chronic pain. Some died young, their families never told why. Others lived long enough to tell their stories, but only after the Soviet state that silenced them had collapsed. And for the Soviet Navy, the Chazhma Bay disaster would become a dark secret buried deep beneath the waves of official propaganda, remembered only by those who witnessed it firsthand, and those who studied the ruins of K-431, a submarine that nearly turned an entire region of the Soviet Far East into a permanent nuclear wasteland. In the days following the explosion, Chazhma Bay transformed from a vibrant naval shipyard into a silent, contaminated landscape where every gust of wind carried invisible poison, every puddle shimmered with radioactive sheen, and every decision from the Soviet command seemed driven less by science and more by fear of scandal. Yet the sailors and workers trapped within the quarantine zone could not afford fear. They had to keep functioning, even as their bodies deteriorated from the inside. The first official order that arrived from the Pacific Fleet headquarters was not a directive on containment, medical triage, or environmental control. It was a directive to classify every detail of the event immediately and forbid all personnel from speaking to outsiders. The disaster was now a state secret, and the consequences for breaking secrecy ranged from expulsion to imprisonment. But even as strict silence was imposed, the reality of the accident could not be hidden from those inside the base. Radiation monitors, once brought online, showed readings so high that technicians refused to approach certain areas without lead shielding. Some meters clicked violently the moment they were switched on, quickly maxing out their scales. In multiple sections of the dock, radiation levels reached thousands of times the lethal threshold. And yet, dozens of uninformed workers continued to clean the site using mops, rags, and buckets, each sweep spreading contamination deeper into the bay and across the shipyard. From morning to night, the cleanup effort continued at breakneck speed because senior officers believed the only way to save their careers, and perhaps their freedom, was to restore the shipyard to normal operations as quickly as possible. Their goal was not to protect their sailors or the environment, but to erase the evidence. Meanwhile, fallout began settling far beyond the immediate blast zone. The convoy road leading out of the base, flanked by pine forest, became a corridor of contamination. Truck wheels kicked up radioactive dust, coating vegetation and drifting onto farm fields miles away. A light rain later that week washed irradiated particles into streams and reservoirs used for drinking water. Local fishermen, oblivious to the unfolding disaster, continued hauling in their catch, unaware that the bay's floor was now covered with radioactive silt. The Soviet Navy issued no advisories. Avoiding panic mattered more than public safety. Inside the shipyard, workers developed alarming symptoms in waves. Some suffered severe nausea, dizziness, and fever. Others experienced strange burns that seemed to appear spontaneously. A few noticed their fingernails turning bluish or black. Many chalked it up to exhaustion until the first deaths began. Those with the heaviest exposures died within days. They were buried quickly in sealed coffins, their causes of death falsified. Families were told their loved ones perished in a steam explosion, a phrase repeated so frequently that it became an almost ritualistic lie. But the truth was unmistakable. These men had absorbed radiation levels comparable to the firefighters at Chernobyl, and like their counterparts half a continent away, they never stood a chance. Soviet leadership could not allow two nuclear disasters in the same year to become public knowledge. So, while Pripyat was reluctantly evacuated and placed under extensive medical monitoring, the victims at Chazhma Bay were treated as a footnote, disposable casualties of a mistake that could not be admitted. As days turned to weeks, decontamination teams were reinforced with sailors from other units, many of whom had no training in nuclear operations. Their commanders ordered them to scrub the dock, repaint structures, cut down contaminated vegetation, and hose off equipment using fire pumps. None of these measures meaningfully reduced radiation, In fact, some spread it further. Water runoff carried particles into the bay. Bulldozers pushed contaminated earth into large piles, forming mounds of radioactive soil that leached isotopes whenever it rained. But the operation had a metric: appearance. If the dock looked clean, if the submarine wreckage was removed, if the shipyard resumed activity, then the disaster could be declared resolved. Whether it was scientifically resolved did not matter. Meanwhile, scientists from the Soviet Navy's nuclear division quietly conducted their own tests. Their internal reports, which would remain classified for decades, revealed the horrifying scale of contamination. Reactor fuel fragments scattered up to several kilometers away. Radiation hotspots in forested hills reaching levels that could deliver lethal doses in under an hour. Microparticles of uranium and plutonium embedded in soil, grass, tree bark, and seawater. These findings were immediately stamped secret and filed away. Orders from Moscow were simple: contain the narrative, not the radiation. But among the workers on the ground, secrecy caused dangerous ignorance. Sailors continued to walk across contaminated ground with standard-issue boots, tracking radioactive mud into barracks, cafeterias, and transport vehicles. Mechanics handled irradiated tools unknowingly. Cooks prepared meals in kitchens dusted with fallout. Even the base laundry facility became contaminated, dispersing radioactive fibers across uniforms and bedding. Soon, radiation sickness appeared in unexpected places. Offices far from the dock, storehouses near the main gate, even living quarters several kilometers inland. The contamination was alive. It moved with footsteps, wind, and rain. For months, the shipyard struggled under the weight of an invisible enemy. Every new day brought more sick workers. Some reported chronic diarrhea and internal bleeding. Others experienced sudden drops in blood pressure. Hair loss became common. A handful suffered neurological symptoms: confusion, memory loss, difficulty speaking. These men were quietly transferred to remote hospitals, where they were treated under false diagnoses. Some returned months later, weakened and pale. Others never returned at all. As for the environment, the bay underwent catastrophic damage. Radiation accumulated in seaweed, shellfish, and sediment. Local marine life exhibited abnormalities. Dead crabs floated to the surface, fish developed lesions, and barnacles clung to contaminated wreckage, absorbing isotopes that would remain active for decades. Although the Navy conducted secret environmental tests, no fishing bans or public notices were issued, and contaminated seafood continued to be sold and consumed throughout the region. Yet the most chilling aspect of the disaster was the quiet acknowledgement within Soviet scientific circles that the explosion could have been vastly worse. A misaligned reactor lid combined with hydrogen buildup had caused the blast. But if the reactor core had been slightly more exposed, or if the fuel had reached critical mass, the detonation could have triggered a full-scale nuclear explosion, vaporizing the entire shipyard and sending fallout across Vladivostok, Nakotka, and potentially even parts of Japan. Some physicists later admitted privately that the Chazhma Bay explosion was millimeters away from becoming the Soviet Union's Pacific Chernobyl, a disaster so enormous that it might have forced the evacuation of entire cities and crippled the Pacific Fleet. But such warnings were also classified. Meanwhile, life at the base attempted to return to normal. Ships came and went. Submarines received maintenance. Crews held formation drills on asphalt still contaminated with radioactive particles. Officers wrote reports claiming the situation was under control, even as they coughed blood into handkerchiefs. And outside the base, Villagers continued their lives completely unaware of the disaster 7 kilometers away. Children swam in streams polluted by runoff. Farmers harvested crops from irradiated soil. For these communities, the legacy of Chazhma Bay would not become evident until years later, when cancer rates quietly rose and an unusual number of residents developed thyroid disorders, leukemia, and reproductive issues. No one linked these illnesses to a naval accident they were never told about. As weeks turned into months, Soviet leadership congratulated the base for resolving the incident efficiently. Medals were quietly awarded to commanders who had overseen the cleanup. None were awarded to the young conscripts who shoveled reactor fragments with bare hands. Some of them died before their award ceremonies were even held. Eventually, K-431's remains were stripped down and transported to a classified storage facility. The dock was repaired. Contaminated soil was dumped into the bay. Fresh paint covered scorched surfaces. To anyone visiting the site, the shipyard appeared as if nothing had happened, but the truth lingered beneath the surface. Literally. Underwater surveys years later found shards of reactor fuel embedded deep in sediment, still emitting radiation. Trees on the hillside carried isotopes in their rings. Soil samples collected a decade later registered contamination levels far higher than any public documents admitted. And for the survivors, the ghost of the explosion continued haunting their bodies. Some experienced chronic fatigue and bone marrow failure. Others developed cancers in their 30s or 40s. Many died prematurely. The Soviet state never recognized them as victims. Their medical records remained classified under the same secrecy that had doomed them to exposure. It would not be until after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, when former officers and scientists finally began speaking openly, that the full extent of the Chazhma Bay disaster emerged. Researchers pieced together accounts from survivors, declassified memos, and forgotten reports. What they uncovered was staggering: a preventable explosion caused by negligence, magnified by chain of command arrogance, concealed through institutional secrecy, and worsened by cleanup efforts that sacrificed human lives for the sake of political optics. And yet, even today, the Chazhma Bay accident remains relatively unknown compared to other nuclear disasters, not because it was small, but because it was buried beneath the weight of Soviet censorship. As the Soviet Union edged toward its collapse in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the truth about Chazhma Bay began leaking out in fragments, whispers among former sailors, rumors spread by retired officers, vague mentions in health studies. But even then, the disaster remained wrapped in layers of denial, secrecy, and institutional shame. When Glasnost arrived, journalists finally attempted to investigate what had happened, but they encountered a wall of silence from the Navy, which still considered the accident too damaging to national prestige. It was only years later, after the fall of the USSR, that a small group of independent scientists published the first public report acknowledging that a nuclear reactor had exploded at the shipyard, sending lethal radiation across the base and into the surrounding environment. What stunned the scientific community was not merely the scale of the contamination, but the depth of the cover-up. According to newly released memos, the Pacific Fleet Command had falsified radiation readings, destroyed medical records, and altered the official death toll to hide the consequences from both Moscow and the world. One declassified document even revealed that the Navy had considered evacuating nearby villages in the first hours after the explosion, but abandoned the idea because it would attract unwanted attention from foreign intelligence agencies. Instead, local families were left in place, unaware they were living downwind of a radioactive plume. Meanwhile, survivors of the accident struggled to obtain medical compensation. Because their exposure records were classified, most received no acknowledgement from the state. Some were told their illnesses had nothing to do with radiation, even when symptoms mirrored those of known nuclear accident victims. Others were accused of exaggeration or dishonesty. Many gave up seeking help altogether, choosing instead to suffer quietly. A few former sailors later recounted that doctors had warned them not to mention radiation exposure in public because it could jeopardize their families' livelihoods. In effect, the Soviet system not only exposed them to lethal contamination, but suppressed their voices long after the danger had passed. The environmental consequences unfolded over decades. Scientific teams visiting Chazhma Bay in the 1990s and 2000s detected elevated levels of cesium-137, strontium-90, plutonium, and uranium isotopes in sediment, marine plants, and shellfish. Some hotspots remained dangerously radioactive even after layers of sediment settled over them. The bay, once a rich fishing ground, became a quiet, ecological casualty of the Cold War. Although fishing remained officially permitted, many locals reported unusual illnesses after consuming seafood caught near the shipyard. A few independent investigators, defying government pressure, collected samples showing radiation levels exceeding international safety standards. Their findings were quietly published in niche scientific journals, ignored by mainstream media, yet impossible to dismiss. For the Russian Navy, the Chazhma Bay disaster became a lesson written in invisible ink, a warning of the consequences of rushing repairs, neglecting safety procedures, and maintaining a culture in which subordinates feared contradicting their superiors. In the years following the explosion, nuclear submarine protocols were revised slowly, sometimes reluctantly, as the Navy attempted to modernize. But the legacy of secrecy lingered. Even today, portions of the accident file remain classified under national security laws. Some officers who served at the base still refuse to discuss what they witnessed, not out of loyalty to the Soviet Union, but out of fear that their admissions might embarrass the modern Russian Navy. Yet despite the official silence, the story of Chazhma Bay continued resurfacing through the memories of those who lived through it. Former conscripts spoke of friends who died young. Retired officers admitted privately that they had been unprepared for the psychological weight of watching men under their command suffer from radiation sickness. Medical staff later confessed that they were instructed to diagnose radiation-exposed patients with digestive disorders or viral illnesses to avoid creating a paper trail. And families of victims began asking questions the Navy still could not answer. Why were the workers not warned? Why were civilians not protected? Why were the dangerous cleanup operations performed with minimal equipment? Why did their loved ones die in silence? These personal stories formed a patchwork of truth that eventually revealed the human side of the disaster, a side the Soviet state had tried desperately to hide. One of the most haunting accounts came from a sailor who survived the initial blast. He described walking through clouds of steam, unaware that radioactive water droplets were settling on his skin. Hours later, he watched men collapse from seizures. Days later, he developed burns that peeled away layers of flesh. He remembered the strange metallic taste in his mouth, the nausea that hit without warning, the confusion that clouded his thoughts. And he remembered the moment he realized the officers supervising the cleanup understood nothing about radiation safety. "They told us to wash the deck with hoses," he said years later. "They didn't know the water was spreading the contamination. We were washing death into the bay." His testimony was just one among dozens that painted a devastating picture. The Navy had asked its men to face a nuclear disaster with the same tools used to scrub rust and oil. The story of Chazhma Bay also exposes a deeper truth about the Soviet system, a truth mirrored in tragedies like Chernobyl, the Kyshtym disaster, and the sinking of the Kursk submarine. Again and again, the same pattern repeated, a dangerous situation caused by negligence, exacerbated by poor communication, then concealed through secrecy that prevented proper safety responses. Chazhma Bay was not an anomaly. It was part of a larger culture in which mistakes could not be admitted, warnings were ignored, and human lives were sacrificed to preserve the appearance of competence. In this sense, the explosion becomes more than a naval accident. It becomes a symbol of the Cold War's darkest contradictions. The Soviet Union invested billions into building one of the world's most powerful submarine fleets, yet failed to ensure that the workers repairing those submarines had basic radiation protection gear. It developed sophisticated nuclear reactors, but neglected the training of the men tasked with servicing them. It pursued technological supremacy while leaving behind a trail of preventable disasters. But Chazhma Bay also forced a reckoning. As researchers uncovered the truth, they realized the disaster had been far worse than the Soviet Navy admitted. The blast had ejected chunks of reactor fuel weighing several kilograms. Some pieces were found hundreds of meters from the dock. Others were lost completely. The possibility that radioactive debris still lies hidden beneath the bay remains a matter of scientific concern. Even today, some oceanographers warn that a major storm or underwater landslide could disturb the sediment and release contaminants back into the water. The long-term health impact remains difficult to measure. Many survivors died before proper medical studies could be conducted. Others were never identified because their exposure records were destroyed. Yet patterns emerged: elevated cancer rates among shipyard workers, unusual clusters of leukemia, thyroid disorders in nearby villages, reproductive complications in families who lived downwind. Although no public health study has provided definitive links, largely because the necessary data was suppressed, independent researchers continue to raise questions. And despite these lingering uncertainties, the Russian government has never issued a formal acknowledgement of the accident's full scale. Internationally, Chazhma Bay remains a footnote in nuclear history, overshadowed by larger disasters. Few outside Russia know the story. Fewer still understand how close the world came to a far greater catastrophe. If the reactor had gone fully critical, the resulting explosion could have contaminated Vladivostok, crippled the Pacific Fleet, and scattered fallout across East Asia. The Cold War would have faced a crisis with global consequences, and the Soviet government would have been unable to hide it. Instead, fate intervened, limiting the blast to a horrific but localized tragedy. The world never knew how lucky it was. In the end, the Chazhma Bay disaster stands as a tragic example of human error, compounded by systemic failure. It reveals how secrecy can be more dangerous than radiation, how denial can be deadlier than explosions, and how the pursuit of political image can cost more than any military victory. It reminds us that behind every classified report are real people, sailors, engineers, families, whose lives were forever changed by decisions made far above their rank. And it forces us to confront a sobering truth. The Cold War's deadliest threats were not always the missiles pointed across borders. Sometimes, the greatest danger comes from within. Today, the waters of Chazhma Bay appear calm. Children fish from the shore. Tourists pass nearby without realizing what happened there. The shipyard continues to operate, maintaining vessels for the modern Russian Navy. But beneath the waves lies a radioactive scar, a silent reminder of the day the Soviet Union nearly nuked itself, and of the men whose lives were swallowed by secrecy. Their story, once buried, now resurfaces through documentaries like this one, ensuring that their sacrifice is not forgotten, and that the lessons of Chazhma Bay echo far beyond the Cold War.